Hola, bienvenidos al podcast del Instituto Fe y Libertad. Mi nombre es Mariana Gracioso, coordinadora de comunicación. En este espacio conversamos con expertos, analizamos posturas sobre economía, religión, libertad y más.
Okay, hello Sam, nice to meet you, nice to see you again after a while.
It has. It's good to see you, Maurice.
Thank you. We are talking about the future, the place of reason and faith in the future of Western civilization. And it is common, I start with my first question. It is common for many Christian authors to emphasize the fact that the achievements of which moderns boast actually have their origin in Christianity. But I see that you present other things around, like when you said like more than a few of the freedoms and achievements now embraced by believing Jews and Christians will have a struggle to see the light of the day without the effort of certain figures associated with the Enlightenment. Would you say that would you say the same about other freedoms that the Catholic Church has been slow to recognize, such as the freedoms of consciousness?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So there's no doubt in my mind that if you look at the sources of the fundamental freedoms that we take for granted today in countries that have been influenced by the civilization of the West, it does seem to me that the essential roots do go back to Judaism, Christianity, the Greek world, the Roman world, and the synthesis that was created around these things, and which came to a type of fruition, I think, in the medieval period. It's simply incomprehensible, I think, that notions of equality in the sense of everyone having equal dignity by virtue of being human, that's very hard to see emerging in the world without first Judaism and then Christianity emphasizing this particular thing. In the Greek and Roman world, slaves, for example, one of the reasons that offered for slavery was that slaves weren't really human. Aristotle said that. They didn't really have the capacity for free choice. They were therefore beings that could be enslaved. Well, Christianity changed that very, very quickly. And we see that, for example, when St. Paul talks about there is neither Jew or Gentile, man or woman, servant or free, and servant, of course, means slave. In the understanding of the world and of human nature fully revealed in the person of Jesus Christ and his message. Now, that said, it's also true, I think, to say that if we look at some particular freedoms today, it took Christianity and Christian societies quite some time to recognize certain liberties. A good example, I think, of course, is the idea of religious liberty. So if you go back to the early church fathers, there's clearly an emphasis upon religious liberty. They talk about the necessity of free choice when it comes to embracing faith and living faith. Now, that insight was lost sight of for quite a long time, especially when it came to those people who were not Christian, living within Christian societies, but also in the period when the state and the church start to become integrated to a certain extent, because what that tended to mean was that dissent from the faith meant that you were essentially putting yourself outside the bounds of legality. So this is why heretics in Catholic countries and Protestant countries after the Reformation were often treated as being the equivalent of terrorists, right? They were seen as somehow people who had separated themselves, were claiming certain things that they could not claim. Now, it's with, I think, Enlightenment thinkers, not all Enlightenment thinkers, but a good number of Enlightenment thinkers, that you first see the emergence of the idea of religious toleration. Now, there were intimations of this in some 16th century Christian thought as a consequence of the wars of religion. There were Christians saying, oh, maybe we need to be a little more tolerant because the alternative is we're going to keep killing each other. But there's no doubt in my mind that we see not just the idea of religious tolerance, but the idea of religious liberty becomes in the sense that people have to be free to choose truth. They can't have truth forced on them. They have to choose the truth, especially religious truth, which, as I mentioned, is an older Christian insight, but it's really brought back to the fore of the Western mind in the 18th century. So the question becomes, would we have got there in this broader and deeper sense of religious liberty without the Enlightenment? And I think the answer is I'm not sure. I'm not sure we would have got there without these types of insights arising from Enlightenment thinkers, many of whom were believing Christians. I think that's important to keep in mind, that we often have this view of the Enlightenment or Enlightenments as being monolithically agnostic, if not atheist, hostile to religion, particularly hostile to Christianity, even more particularly hostile to Catholicism. Well, there were elements of some Enlightenments that were like that. The late French Enlightenment, I think, certainly did take on a quite anti-Christian and specifically anti-Catholic dimension. But that's not true of the Scottish Enlightenment. That's not true of the American Enlightenment, etc. So I think this broader point that you're making about these liberties, I think it reflects also the need for us today to be more discerning about what type of enlightenment we are discussing. So when the French Enlightenment, the late French Enlightenment, talked about religious liberty, they talked about freedom from religion. They wanted to free people from what they thought was the superstition of religion. Whereas in the Scottish Enlightenment, it was much more about people, and the American Enlightenment, was much more about people should be able to choose the religious truth that they think is true and not have this forced upon them. So that's an important difference.
Yeah, I think this is very important. Thank you very much. Well, next, Patrick Deneen argues that liberalism is a victim of its own success. Louis Rouillère, in The Genius of the West, thinks that the best thing that the West has given to the world is science and technology. You speak of National Socialism and Marxism-Leninism as ideologies that, although born in the West, are antithetical to it. Could it be said that it is very much the Westerner's own way of criticizing his own culture? Is it a particular trait of Western culture to criticize its own culture?
Well, I think it's fair to say that ideologies like Marxism, in a sense, reflect a type of pseudo-religion and a pseudo-religious outlook. So Marxism was never, for example, able to escape the idea of orthodoxy. It had a sort of church-like body called the Communist Party. It had a hierarchy of party officials going all the way up to the general secretary. It had sacred books, right? So the books of people like Marx and Engels and Lenin, etc. So as an ideology, it reflects certain aspects of the religious impulse, particularly as that took on form in Western countries. So in that case, I think what we see is, I don't see those things as a critique from within of the West. I see those things as taking on certain features of Western civilization, particularly its religious dimension, and transforming them in ways that are actually quite against the understanding of these things of faith and reason that the West had always viewed the world through. When it comes to the issue of science and technology, it's important to remember that some of the great scientists that we think of as associated with being this gift to the West of science and technology, again, we make this assumption that the scientists who are engaged in this exercise were somehow all closet agnostics or atheists. Well, that's not true. Isaac Newton, who's sort of the hero of Enlightenment thought, right, was a believing Christian. Johannes Kepler, who was a great astronomer, another believing Christian. Galileo was a devout Catholic. He wasn't a sort of crypto-atheist or anything like that. And if you go through certainly the 18th century and you look at and 19th century and you look at some of the scientists of the time, there are plenty of them who were believing Christians of one form or another. And they saw no conflict between being a religious believer in the tradition of the West and being someone who took science and technology seriously. In fact, there are some people who would argue that the whole modern scientific enterprise really begins in the medieval period with people like Albertus Magnus, for example, who was Thomas Aquinas's great teacher. He was deeply interested in things like the scientific method. He was deeply interested in trying to discern the physical laws that shape the environment in the world around us. So I think, again, this is another example of where popular myths about the Enlightenment and a failure to understand the deep connections between the way that modern science has emerged and the tradition of faith and reason that goes back in Western history even longer. These things are intimately linked to each other. We also know that problems emerge when we start to absolutize things like science and technology. And that becomes a problem, right? Because science and technology, they can show us how to do things. They can teach us about what works, what is functional, how things relate to each other in the natural world. They can teach us how to transform aspects of the natural world. But they can't tell us the answer to, is this good or is this bad? Is this moral or is this immoral? It's incapable of doing that. So I think one of the challenges today, especially for religious believers, is to make it very clear that the whole scientific endeavor and enterprise is deeply shaped and influenced by the religions of the West, because the religions of the West took truth seriously, including scientific truth. It was never opposed to any of these things. In fact, it was very supportive of these things. And that, I think, is part of the exercise of recovery we need if we're going to properly understand the power and the significance and the great knowledge revealed by science, and to make a distinction between that and scientism. Scientism is the ideology that you can only understand anything by use of the scientific method, which isn't true, right? Because the scientific method can't explain itself. It can't verify itself. The whole scientific enterprise doesn't emerge from science in itself. It emerges from the desire to know truth. And the desire to know truth is not generated by science. It's not created by science. It's innate to who we are as human beings.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that the fact that the scientists or the some of these people who see an opposition between religion and science say that because of ignorance, but we know that there is no opposition between that the scientists are ignorant of the fact that the roots of the science and faith is that true? Do you think that some of the scientists that see a position between faith and reason say that because of the ignorance of the theological roots, we say, of our civilization, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that is certainly partly to do with it. It's a type of ignorance of history. It's an ignorance of the history of ideas. But it's also a tendency to think that faith is irrational, that faith has nothing to do with reason, that faith is somehow operating in opposition to reason. Now, of course, the problem with that is that, as Augustine says, an act of faith is in many respects an act of reason, right? So faith is not, in fact, a leap into the dark. Faith is, as St. Paul says, evidence of things yet unseen. We can know certain things. We can look at the natural world and say, it seems like there's design. And if there's design, then there must be a designer, right? But the other part of the problem is the tendency, which we talked a little bit about before, the tendency to absolutize science, to say that it is the only form of reason. And we've already discussed how that's simply not true. But the good news, I think, is that there were always plenty of scientists who have understood the deeper historical and even theological roots of the modern sciences, who have also understood that the scientific method is not the only form of reason, that the scientific method, in fact, relies upon forms of reasoning that are not scientific in themselves. There's also, interestingly, a good number of physicists today who would argue that the idea of a first cause, that there is a being that stands at the beginning of time and transcends time and permeates time, is a far more scientifically viable position to hold than to believe that at the beginning was nothing, that at the beginning was chaos, that at the beginning there is essentially a blank space. Darwin himself, who was essentially an agnostic, if not an atheist, certainly towards the end of his life, said in a number of places, including in his autobiography, that it's just very difficult to escape the idea that there is a type of first cause, that science itself and the scientific method tends to point back in that direction. So I think that's a hopeful sign, that there are people today, physicists, other chemists, biologists, etc., even people who are sort of very committed to evolution as a type, almost as a type of ideology, who are conceding that the notion that everything emerges from nothing is a scientifically and rationally untenable position.
Speaking about scientists, Westerners have a deep-rooted conviction that God is rational. It is said that Einstein, who was not particularly religious, but a theist certainly, once told Heisenberg that God does not play dice, to which Heisenberg responded by saying that who was he to tell God what to do? Could it not be said that this view of God is a projection of our own?
Well, the argument, of course, is that because humans have rationality, we are projecting back that rationality when we try to describe the creator. So that's the argument you often hear.
Sure.
But what that doesn't deal with is the question of where does reason emerge from in the first place? Reason can't come from irrationality. Reason can't emerge from unreason. Reason cannot develop out of nothingness. It must be rooted somewhere. And how human beings became rational, I mean, that's an interesting discussion, and there's lots of scientists would have various opinions about that, how human beings developed rationality. But that, to my mind, is a sort of secondary question to the issue of where reason emerges from in the first place. And it's just very hard to believe that reason emerged out of a type of chaos that and somehow it just evolved adaptation to everything around us. And the other thing, of course, is that, which I think is also pointing back to the case that human reason itself points to the idea of a rational God, is that we can engage in self-reflection and we can make judgments about our actions and our choices in a way that other beings can't, which tells us, I think, that our reason is much more powerful than we often give it credit for. It also tells us, I think, that the degree to which we can engage in self-reflection, which means we can ask questions about some of these deeper issues, itself points to an impulse to know the truth about where we come from and where our rationality comes from as well. So it's not just so I think this is very important if we're trying to make an argument for a type of natural theology argument for the existence of a rational God. The fact that we can perceive design in the world, the fact that we can discern when we think people are acting in rational and irrational ways. All of that, I think, points to the idea that this rationality just didn't spontaneously emerge out of the mud. There must be some other being that that acted, that chose to do a something rather than another thing.
Yeah, it's a complex question anyway, but let's make another. Michael Allen Gillespie, in The Theological Roots of Modernity, argues that the modern world is the child of voluntarism and nominalism. Mm-hmm. Do you think that these doctrines, both proposed by Franciscan monks, by the way, mm-hmm. are in part contrary to the view of God as a rational being? What do you think of Gillespie's thesis?
Well, there's no doubt that nominalism, which is the idea that nothing really has an essence beyond what we choose to give it. Mm. So the chair in front of me, or the computer that I'm looking at through you and looking at you, it has the only meaning it has is whatever meaning I give it. Mm. Or if I look at other people, and so I see what I see is what I choose to give it. That's the nominalism. So I'm naming things as I see them, rather than recognizing the reality that's being presented to my mind, to my reason. And that's unquestionably an idea that emerged in some parts of medieval Europe. Not long after the death of Thomas Aquinas. We're really talking about figures like William of Ockham, who many people would regard as a sort of founder of nominalism. Now, modernity itself is a complicated thing. So, because on the one hand, it certainly does make a break with certain things that were characteristic of the medieval world. But at the same time, modernity draws upon things that were pre-existent in the medieval and the ancient world. So whether it's things like nominalism, which I think there are clearly precedents for that in some medieval thinkers, or skepticism. Right? Skepticism is not something that suddenly emerged with David Hume in the middle of the 18th century. Philosophical skepticism has been around for a long period of time, and in fact, at different times, it was the intellectually dominant position in parts of the Greek world, including in Plato's academy for long periods of time. So I guess what I'm pointing to is we have to be very careful before we start saying that modernity somehow represents a fundamental shift, a fundamental break with lots of things in the past. I think it's better for us to realize, it's more accurate for us to realize that what we call modernity today is a result of a combination of different ideas, older ideas, and some newer ideas. And it's certainly true, I think, that some aspects of modernity, particularly the notion that we absolutize subjectivity in the sense of I, the subject, and the person who are deciding what things are called. I'm determining what their essence are rather than recognizing their essence. There were medieval thinkers who thought that as well. So intellectual history and the emergence of different epochs in history is not as clear-cut as many people imagine it is, even in the conditions of the modern world. And I think we can talk about the modern world in a way that we can say the modern world is different in certain respects from the medieval world. Even in the modern world, that modern world still bears many influences that go back to the Greeks, the Romans, the Jews, and the Christians.
Thank you. And now let's talk about the place of science and technology, which for Louis Rougier is the best that the West has given to the world. To what extent is this belief in the rationality of God and the world responsible for a scientist mentality, which often leads to a naturalism that considers religion as a stage already overcome?
Well, as we've talked about before, there's no doubt in my mind that the scientific enterprise begins before modernity, really starts in the medieval world with people, as we mentioned, Albertus Magnus, in medieval universities where people are studying things like geometry, physics, chemistry, etc. And it was driven by the quest to know the truth about the world. So that's one thing, and that's, I think, it's very hard to dispute that. But there is a difference between the way in which I think the medieval mind approached the scientific enterprise compared to at least some modern thinkers. So while the medieval mind is thinking scientifically as a way of trying to understand the world that God has created around us, the modern scientist is interested in that. But the modern scientist also has a predilection for wanting to use a lot of that knowledge to transform the world, right? Now, I mean, there's plenty of religious believers who use the scientific method in the same way as well, right? But it does seem to me that a medieval thinker is primarily interested in knowing the truth about these things through science, whereas some modern thinkers, the point of the scientific enterprise is not just to understand the world, it's to transform the world profoundly, in a way to become a sort of master of the universe. And if you read some thinkers who wrote about this, particularly in the early modern period, that's very much part of the way that they talk about these sorts of things. And at least with some of these thinkers, not all, but with some of these thinkers, the question of God gets reduced to subjectivity. And science is seen as the only really objective intellectual enterprise. Now, I happen to think that's a mistaken understanding of these things. I think things like philosophy, things like theology are profoundly undergirded by human rationality, and that we can arrive at certain knowledge of certain truths through using our reason in disciplines through theology and science. It's also true that the scientific, there are limits to the, let's call it the scientific method's ability to know the fullness of truth. Why do we say this? Because the scientific application of the scientific method to any number of problems is subject to verification. The results of the experiment are subject to verification. which means that scientific theories change based on empirical evidence and experiments. We have had scientific theories emerge and then be discarded as being recognized as untrue or only partly true or even not very true at all. So the scientific enterprise, its own claims to being some sort of this objective dimension of things that can arrive at definitive, in the sense that means definitive truth about these things. Well, the very nature of the scientific enterprise is that it's constantly discovering new things, which means we go back and change what we thought was true before, at least scientifically. We see this particularly in things like medicine, things like physics, things like chemistry, etc. So all those things, I think, show us that this radical distinction between faith is subjective and science is objective simply doesn't stand up to closer analysis. It's a much more complicated affair than that.
Maybe the part of the problem is the different idea of nature that medievals and ancients have compared with the modern, and that's because of nominalism, I think, because if the concept of nature as a guide and rule and limit of what you can do is lost, then the modern see nature as being able to be transformed, right?
Yes.
It's a different conception.
Yes. No, that's certainly part of it. And now, again, we need to be careful about making rigid distinctions between the medieval and the modern, or even the medieval, the modern, and the ancient. There were ancient thinkers who did think you could shape human nature, right? We tend to think of people like Plato and Aristotle and others who have this idea that there is the natural law, that we can know these things, there are certain fixed aspects of human nature, but there are also ancient philosophers who took a very different view. Likewise, in our own time, there were some significant differences among the different enlightenments about human nature, right? So you had late French Enlightenment thinkers who really did think that you could transform human nature in particular ways. On the other hand, you had Scottish Enlightenment thinkers who said, no, we can understand and know more about human nature, but we can't change human nature itself. So we can use the social sciences to understand more about humans and the human world, humans as individuals, as communities, as political actors or economic actors or social actors or whatever it happens to be. But human nature in itself doesn't change. So I think that's maybe a better way to sort of approach it, at least historically speaking, is to understand that people who believe that you can change human nature, you can find such people in the modern, medieval, and ancient world, and then you can find people who believe that human nature is essentially fixed and unchanging in the ancient, in the medieval, and in the modern world. But that division between those who think that human nature is infinitely malleable and those who think, no, it's not, it is, I think, a fundamental division today. But it was also a division in much of the ancient world and in parts of the medieval world as well. And I think asking that question, do you think human nature is fixed, or do you think human nature can be transformed, often tells you why people end up on a variety of different political, economic, and social positions. To take economics, for example, I think that in the case of people who believe in free markets tend to hold a view that human nature doesn't change. They think there's self-interest. They think there's a type of rationality. There's human needs don't change, etc. Whereas people who were very much influenced by who adopted a more central planning view of the economy, they really did think, people like Marx, but also people like some of the central planners in the 1940s and 1950s, they really did think that through top-down control of the economy via the state, you could change human nature itself.
finally, just one last question. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of our civilization?
Yes, nice, easy question to end with. Well, I'm not a pessimist. I'm not an optimist. I'm a person of hope. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. Optimism can be a sense of the English expression is being a Pollyanna, which means you're just anxiously looking for good things and you're going to find them no matter what they are. Hope is different. It's a confidence. It's a type of confidence. And a society that lacks hope is a society, I think, or a civilization that lacks hope is a society that is going to have some significant problems, because when you lack hope, you end up lacking self-belief. You lack self-belief, you have no desire or interest or incentive to try and preserve really anything, let alone an entire civilization. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that the history of the West illustrates, I think, that it has a remarkable capacity for rejuvenation. Mm-hmm. Western societies have been through some very dark periods. And many people in Western societies have done some very bad, evil things. Some very bad, evil ideas have emerged in Western societies. And yet, the Western societies do seem to have, at least up until now, a capacity to correct themselves, to recognize when something has gone wrong and readjust, or to go back to the sources of Western civilization, Greeks, Romans, Jews, Christians, the medieval syntheses of all these things, the better parts of the Enlightenment, and to say, this is our heritage, and now we need to bring it to bear upon the present. So as long as Western societies maintain that capacity, I think we have reason to be hopeful about these things. It's easy to be pessimistic. It's very easy to be pessimistic. It's also tempting to be optimistic in this unthinking, enthusiastic way that's not attentive to reality. But I think if you're a person of hope, and if you have confidence that in the end, human nature and human reason is permeated by the Logos, which, as you know, is at the beginning of the Gospel of John, right? So it says, what does it say? In the beginning was the Word, and the word in Greek that was used in the Gospel of John is Logos. Logos means the creative reason, the being of reason, who is at the beginning of time, who transcends time, who's active in the world, and who is at the end of time. As long as you understand that, and you understand all the implications of that, I think you can have reason to be hopeful.
Okay, thank you very much. Some very interesting.
Thank you, Maurice. Good to be with you, and thank you, and hello to all my friends at Fe Libertad and Université Francisco Marroquín and in Guatemala as a whole.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.